Hey everybody, I'm Fox with FoxeoGames, and this is I Am Setsuna on the PC, also available for the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation Vita. Let me start by giving you a little bit of backstory to this. I Am Setsuna was basically hailed as a sort of callback to the nostalgic times of old school JRPGs. That is, in particular, the 16-bit role-playing games, and in more specific terms, Chrono Trigger. You don't have to play I Am Setsuna for very long to see that it does have its roots in Chrono Trigger. The combat system most of all resembles that game, and also the overworld as well. Given that the game is supposed to harken back to the good old days of when Square used to produce the best, most sought-after JRPGs, then I'm certainly the target for that kind of nostalgia. I played a lot of the old school JRPGs, and in particular, I really enjoyed Final Fantasy VI, Secret of Mana, and of course, Chrono Trigger. Taking a look at I Am Setsuna, it's not very visually impressive. It does have a unique art style all to itself, but it doesn't really blend very well. I talked about this in my Fox First Scent of the game, but the backgrounds are drawn 2D art, and the character models and other enemies and such are all 3D. Unfortunately, the 3D rendered character models on top of the 2D art in the background just doesn't really work for me. I think the two clash in a very negative way and ultimately end up making the game look a bit odd. And on the topic of the 3D visuals, they really look kinda cheap. I mean, take a look at these characters' legs. There are no feet whatsoever to speak of, they just sort of taper off into little stilts. The graphics in the game really remind me of something I might see on a mobile game that I'm playing on my cell phone. As for character design, it's alright. It's not bad, but it's not particularly good either. In general, I just don't feel like the characters were all that inspired in terms of their design. There is some 2D art for the characters, but I'm not really sure it blends all that well with the 3D models. I mean, the 2D art that you see in the menus looks a whole lot better than the 3D models that you normally see when you're running around in the game. Another odd thing about the game is whenever I'm moving around, all of the textures look pretty sharp, and they're okay, not great, but not terrible, but when I come to a complete stop and I don't move around, they actually look pretty blurry. I mean, take a look. I have no idea what that's about, but it definitely doesn't look good, and when you notice it, you can't unnotice it. Everything in I Am Setsuna is apparently covered with snow. There are snowy landscapes, snowy mountains, villages in the snow, there's a snow overworld, there are trees covered with snow, there's snow everywhere, and ultimately, maybe it's just me, but I almost started to feel like a little claustrophobic. The entire world started to feel the same, just one snowy landscape after another. I mean, take a look at this. I can't help but feel that the snow was used as a way to sort of disguise the fact that there are no decent textures in most of the game. I mean, it's really easy to just throw snow on everything, and therefore you don't have to actually design textures for stuff. I very quickly grew tiresome of the snow, and I couldn't wait to get out of it. Unfortunately, this is where most of the game happens. Back to character models, the enemy designs are not terrible, but again, they look really cheap, something you might see in a free-to-play MMORPG. A lot of cutesy animal-type characters. I mean, you fight these penguin-like things over and over again, as well as many enemies that look like turtles and other creatures of that sort. Even when they try to make the creatures look scary, they really don't look scary. They look more cutesy than anything else, and I don't think it really blends well with the story, which is trying to be a bit on the serious side. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to say that visually, the game is just weak. And sticking with the presentation, let's talk about the music, because I don't have a lot of positive things to say about it. The tracks are pretty much all piano, just nothing but piano. And when I say that, you're not going to believe me until you listen to it for yourself. Because this is a game from Square Enix, I don't want to actually play the music because that company is copyright hungry to eat up all the videos on YouTube that use any of their content, but just go ahead and give this game a play and listen to the background music and listen to the foreground music in combat. Just all of the music, nothing but piano. Some of it's okay, it's not bad, but a couple tracks being all piano is fine. The entire soundtrack being pretty much nothing but piano, it almost feels like one of those cheap, relaxing piano song CDs that you'd pick up at a place like Target while you're also trying to figure out which bathroom you're supposed to use. Overall, the music is just overly simple, and it gets incredibly repetitive really fast. The same tracks play over and over and over again, and there are times when a track will play for less than a few seconds, and then it'll jump to another track, and then that track will quickly end, and maybe jump back to the track you were just listening to. It's not uncommon for JRPGs like this to go from one song to the next, but this kept doing it over and over again, and it just didn't feel right. The dialogue in the game is pretty much all text. There's really no voice acting. The only time you hear voices are when you're in combat and they make little phrases or grunts. Basically things like "Yorizo" and all those other Japanese phrases that you commonly hear. I don't like to hear them, so I turned them off, but unfortunately I could only find an option to turn off the hero voices. The other characters would keep saying whatever they say. Just like the piano music, it gets incredibly repetitive, but this is a common problem with a lot of JRPGs, and I wish they would all offer us the option to simply turn them all off. I hate hearing them, they get incredibly annoying after a short period of time. But I will say this, I actually don't mind the lack of voice acting, because oftentimes the voice acting is bad and just pulls you out of the story. I don't mind reading the entire story, reading all of the dialogue. That's what I grew up on. I played games on the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo when voice acting was an impossibility. And the thing was, you could pretend that the characters sounded like whatever you wanted them to sound like. It's kind of like when you read a novel. You don't have to worry about a character with an annoying voice because there are no voices. You make up the voice in your head. The other benefit to me in having a JRPG be all text is that I'm pretty good at speed reading through stuff like this, so I love being able to just mash that button and read really quickly, therefore getting through the story segments a lot faster. And this is especially useful when the story is not very interesting. And the story in I Am Setsuna is not great. It's not bad, but it's not great. You see, the story is just pretty uninspired and mediocre at best. It's so mediocre, in fact, that it tends to just err on the side of bad because it's mediocre. You know, you played so many JRPGs by this point in your gaming career that when you play another one that has another trite story with archetypal characters and tropes and all of the same phrases you hear over and over again, we must do it, no we can't do it, we have no choice, and all these other things, it just gets tiresome. Nothing about the story here really drew me in. The character development wasn't terrible, you learn a little bit about the characters, but not enough to really make them interesting and not enough for me to care about them. So as for the overall presentation of I Am Setsuna, it is pretty weak, because the port itself also has a few problems. There are virtually no graphics options to speak of. There's resolution, full screen or window, and that's it. An additional problem with the port is that the keyboard and mouse controls are actually really bad. In fact, this little thing that pops up when you first launch the game cannot be navigated with the mouse. At least I couldn't find a way to navigate it with the mouse. I had to use the keyboard and use the keyboard arrows, which is kind of odd because it looks like it should totally be navigable with the mouse. Is navigable a word? Navigatable? Navigable? Somebody look that up and let me know in the comments. In addition to all these problems, I use an Xbox One controller, which according to Microsoft is supposed to be compatible with any game that uses the direct input system. Basically, any game that uses an Xbox 360 controller should be able to use just fine the Xbox One controller as well. That's not the case here. In fact, if you try to use an Xbox One controller, you'll get stuck in this loop where you can't even exit the game. You basically can't get started, you can't exit, you can't do anything. Basically, I had to Alt F4 and forcibly close the game, then look online for a solution, and apparently there's no solution for a wireless dongle for the Xbox One controller, which is the normal way I use it, so I plugged in the micro USB cable, then installed some other drivers for it, and went into my device manager and had to fiddle around in there a little bit. And I imagine most people aren't going to know how to do that, so that's a big problem. Given the number of people who are going to be playing this game with an Xbox One controller on their PC, that's a huge issue. Additionally, the game advertises full controller support on Steam, and of course one of the most basic controllers that gamers are using on the PC is the Xbox 360 and Xbox One controllers. When it comes to the gameplay in I Am Setsuna, it is clearly inspired by Chrono Trigger in particular, and JRPGs from the past in general. I have absolutely no problem with games that want to borrow gameplay elements and mechanics from other games. In fact, I love the Darksiders series, and the first Darksiders game was basically The Legend of Zelda plus God of War blended together. As you move throughout the game, you quickly realize it's that old school isometric viewpoint. Now I know it's not truly a mathematical isometric, some people have pointed that out, but this is typically what we call isometric. To me, top down is direct top down. You know, some of those old school Nintendo games where you'd see the top of the character's head and their shoulders? That's what I consider top down. To me, this is isometric. You can move around on an overworld and you do not encounter enemies here. This is basically where you can find some hidden items, which are little shiny spots, as well as enter into forests, mountain passes, towns, and other locations. Once you get inside these places, this is where you can encounter combat, as well as go into villages, buy stuff, and talk to people, of course. When you get into combat, again, Chrono Trigger will pop into your mind if you've ever played that game, because you have 3 characters, you can attack, use a tech, or use an item. Exact same setup as Chrono Trigger. There's a little bit different here though. Although you do the same combos, including a cross attack, which is called X Strike, basically it's the exact same thing. A couple of the new features they added that weren't present in Chrono Trigger is the fact that you have to equip these things called Sprite Knights, which are basically the little whatever they are that determine the text that you have for your character. There are certain ones that can be equipped by any character, but many of them are locked to specific characters, so you can't necessarily give everybody the cure ability or give everybody the ability to use the aerial strike. The other big change here is that there's a timed button press when your character is about to initiate an attack, and this is called momentum, where you build this up and can get additional bonuses. The problem I had with it is I couldn't quite figure out what the timing was. In fact, after I initiated a command, boom! If nothing else was happening, my character would do that command immediately, and I felt like there was no chance to get that button press in. So I ended up just kind of mashing the button around the time that I thought my character would attack. Sometimes I get it, and sometimes I wouldn't. Combat is turn-based, just like any good old-school JRPG, but there are two ways to do this. You can choose between the wait system and the active system. If you choose the wait system, then as soon as your ATB gauge fills all the way up, that character can do something, and the game will just wait for that character to initiate their command. Everyone else is waiting, none of the other gauges are building up. If you choose active, what that means is that if you're taking a particularly long time to choose something, you have to be careful with that, because the enemies, as well as your other players, their ATB gauges are building up as well. And if you just sit there fiddling around in the menus, the enemies will continue to attack you, so there is some need for speed. And just like Chrono Trigger, once again, you bump into enemies on the actual game screen. It's not randomized. You don't get random encounters as you walk around. Thank goodness, because who really likes random encounters? I think that's one thing that disappeared from games that we all can say we don't miss. Unfortunately, this is true even more so than it was in Chrono Trigger, but nearly all of these fights are basically mandatory because there's no way to get around them. There's a few that you can skip, but essentially you have to fight them all. No matter how hard I tried to sneak around some of these battles, I always ended up triggering the fight. Of course, it's best to trigger the fight when the enemies are looking away from you when you come in towards their back, because then you'll start out with your ATB gauges full. If you encounter them any other way, well, you won't start out that way, so you won't have that immediate benefit. Just like combat in Chrono Trigger, where you and the enemies are in this battlefield is actually relevant, because many of your attacks will have an AoE range. The problem I've always had with this here, and even in Chrono Trigger, is that you can't control the movement of your characters, and neither could you obviously control the movement of the enemy characters. In fact, it's all completely randomized. The enemies will just sort of wander around at times, or you'll hit enemies and knock them over in certain locations. The problem with this is, if an enemy is going to blow up after they're defeated, which one enemy does constantly all the time, which is frustrating, then if all of your characters are stacked up next to it, even though you know it's going to self-explode, it's going to implode and blow itself up, there's no way to move your characters out of harm's way. You just have to sit there and watch it happen. I felt this way about Chrono Trigger, and I especially feel this way about a new game that just came out. If you're going to make placement on the battlefield during the battle a relevant factor in determining when you take damage, or if you're healed, or if your ability hits multiple enemies, then allow us to move the characters around on the battlefield. If I know an attack's coming, I don't want to leave all three characters right there to take the full brunt of the attack. I would like to move at least one of them if I've got the time. The combat in the game is really okay, but it feels like an older system that has just a few minor improvements that don't do enough to keep me interested in it. Nostalgia is great, but sometimes developments have improved systems so that they're now more fun, more interesting, and more intricate. In this case, I think this old school system ultimately just becomes kind of boring. I also had a major complaint that the game seems to be lacking any sort of like inns or places to rest and heal up your characters. This is especially important because you basically have tech points, and when you run out of tech points you can't use any of your special abilities and are stuck doing nothing more than attacking or maybe using an item. Because it's extremely difficult to refill your tech and health points when you're just plugging along attacking normal enemies using these techs, you'll suddenly discover, oh, now we're bumping into a boss, usually after a save point granted, but given that there's no tent at the save point or any equivalent of an inn, you oftentimes have to encounter this boss with less than full tech points and less than full health. What this means is that it's possible to bump into a boss with one or more of your characters unable to use any of their tech abilities because you're out of points. Granted, you can buy some items that can refill these, both your health and your tech points, but they're fairly expensive given the price of everything else in the game, and it's not easy to come upon money. In fact, I think there's one point in the game where you can literally get stuck and not be able to complete it. If you're saving along with only one save file, which is always a terrible idea in RPGs, then you may actually get stuck at this point. This is a minor spoiler, no big story reveal here, but basically you get on this airship. You have to fight a boss, Then after that, when you go to exit the airship, you get stuck in another mandatory boss encounter. Now yes, in between these two bosses, you can use items and you can save your game, and that's where the problem lies. If you save your game there and overwrite your previous save, something a lot of people are going to do, you may find yourself stuck, because if you've got very few tech points, or even if you've exhausted all of your tech points on the last boss, which is very much a possibility, and you're low on health and you don't have items to heal up your health or restore your tech points, well, you have to fight the next boss in that exact condition. So if one of your characters is nearly dead, the other two are about at a third health, and none of them have tech points, that's how you have to fight the next boss encounter. There's no chance to go anywhere else. You can't fast travel, you can't sneak out to go to a shop, you can't fight any other enemies. You have to go from this boss to the next boss, and if you can't defeat the next boss because you're too low on health and tech points, I do believe you're actually stuck. At various points in the game, they'll give you the option to choose one of two dialogue paths, usually something like, yes I agree, or no I don't agree. Oftentimes these options look like they're giving you some sort of choice. For example, there was a point at which we stumbled upon this mysterious man/creature, and you're given the option to attack him or not. Regardless of what you choose, you will not attack him. In fact, this option comes up twice. Both times I chose attack, and neither time did we attack. You see, the game is on a preset path, and that's fine. That's usually how JRPGs work. But if you're going to give me a choice, make it a relevant choice that actually is a choice and doesn't just look like a choice when we're going to do the same thing regardless of which one I pick. Am Setsuna is also a fairly short game for a JRPG, clocking in at around 20 hours. And unfortunately, many of those hours are far less than interesting, because you get a whole lot of menial tasks that you have to complete that feel like nothing more than padding to make the game look like it's longer than it is. The tasks that you're given also feel really cheap. You'll be told something like, oh hey, we don't know where this guy is, we need him to go forward, go find him somewhere, and now you gotta go wander around and look for him. At one point early in the game, a character wants you to go back someplace you've already been, so you fully backtrack, go back there, she goes up in there, there's a short little bit of dialogue, and then tells you, okay, she's ready, and then you go right back to where you were before you started back there backtracking. You essentially backtrack to where you've already been, and then backtrack to the place you backtracked from. Look, I'm an old school gamer. I played all the Nintendo games, the Super Nintendo games, back when they were brand new. I used to wait with bated breath for the next Squaresoft RPG to come out. And yes, I said Squaresoft, not Square Enix. I was really hoping for Am Setsuna to be that old school nostalgic JRPG that would bring me back to my roots, make me feel like I'm a kid again. I'd just get lost in the story and it would end before I wanted it to. But unfortunately, I just found the game pretty boring. The music got incredibly repetitive and irritating, and eventually I just turned it all the way down so I could listen to an iPod or watch a YouTube video. In fact, for a lot of the game, particularly the combat, I just mashed the A button as I watched a YouTube video on my second monitor. Ultimately, my verdict is that Am Setsuna is an uninspired, uninteresting snooze fest with a slightly interesting combat system that tries to harken back to the old days, but ultimately fails to be an interesting game in and of itself. Given that the PC port also has some major issues, I don't really see a lot of positives here. It should be pretty obvious by now, but I recommend you pass on this one. Am Setsuna just isn't interesting enough to warrant your time and money when there are plenty of other games to play.